Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we're diving deep into a figure everyone thinks they know, Rosa Parks.
Right.
You see that iconic image, December 1st, 1955, refusing to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery.
And that moment, it's absolutely essential, no question. But what the sources you've shared really highlight is that, well, this wasn't just some spontaneous thing by a tired seamstress.
Right, not just tired feet.
No. It was really the combination of decades of living under, intense oppression, years of dedicated activism, and kind of a lifetime spent preparing, maybe without even fully knowing it, for that specific moment. It's a much richer, longer story than just that one day.
Exactly. So our mission here in this deep dive is to really unpack that longer story, to understand what was going on in her life, her community, and, well, the country. That all built towards that single act of defiance. What really led Rosa Parks to that bus seat? Let's dig in.
Okay.
So the sources, they take us back way before 55. They really focus on the early 1940s, especially the summer of 1943 in Montgomery.
Yeah. And there's this really striking contradiction happening. America's fighting fascism abroad, World War II.
All right, a big war effort.
But right there at home, people like Rosa Parks are facing this brutal, everyday segregation.
It's a bitter irony, as the sources put it. And it really profoundly impacted Black Americans. You had things like the WWII campaign.
Victory at home and abroad.
Exactly. Victory against fascism overseas and victory against racism at home. And it wasn't just like an idea. The sources describe Black soldiers, men who fought for the country.
In uniform.
Coming home or just traveling and still being forced to the back of the bus, still facing the same humiliations.
And for Rosa Parks personally, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. She'd been married to Raymond Parks since 32. And the sources say he was already involved in pretty dangerous work, like raising money for the Scottsboro Boys case.
Which was incredibly risky back then. Yeah. Their apartment actually became this quiet meeting place, hushed late-night talks about fighting injustice. And so the war is changing the world, but in Montgomery, the basic injustice wasn't changing.
Absolutely not. And her own daily life just reinforced it constantly.
Yeah.
Working as a seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store.
Right.
She saw it all the time.
Yeah.
The systematic dehumanization the sources describe. Black customers shuffled off to separate worse facilities, using back doors, being pressured not to make eye contact. It wasn't just rules, it was about power.
Constant reinforcement.
Yeah, who's on top, who isn't.
But then here's a kind of surprising detail from the sources. The war years, they actually opened up some unexpected doors.
The labor
shortages, right. So new jobs opened up, and Rosa Parks took one at Maxwell Air Force Base. Federal employment.
And crucially integrated.
Yeah, for the first time, she's in an integrated environment.
That contrast.
Yeah.
Wow. It must have been really eye-opening to see firsthand that segregation wasn't like natural or inevitable,
right,
but a deliberate system, a construct of white supremacy. The sources suggest this was a really revelatory experience for her. Showed her a different way was possible.
But there's the flip side. The sources also stress the dark side. When the war ended, there was this brutal backlash. Returning Black veterans who'd fought for freedom, they expected rights. Instead, they met with swift, violent resistance.
Beaten, denied GI Bill benefits.
Some even murdered just for trying to register to vote. Their service meant nothing, basically, if you were Black in the South then.
Imagine living through that. You get a glimpse of equality at Maxwell. You see your community serving the nation, risking their lives.
Yeah.
And then you're thrown right back into this system determined to crush you.
Right.
How does seeing that possibility of something better not harden your resolve when you're back in the old reality? That period, the 40s, it was a real crucible.
So with all that as background, the sources show Rosa Parks shifting, moving from mainly observing to, well, direct action. She joins the Montgomery NAACP chapter in 1943, and she was one of the few women really deeply involved at that level, especially in those early years.
And this work, the sources describe it almost like a modern underground railroad. But focused on restoring voting rights for Black citizens, rights that had been systematically taken away since Reconstruction. And trying to get them back was incredibly dangerous, slow, methodical work.
And the hurdles were huge, weren't they? The sources detail this deliberately complex bureaucracy, these absurd literacy tests, poll taxes, and Rosa Parks' bravery, it's clear. She would actually go with prospective Black voters to the courthouse.
Knowing the risk.
Knowing it courted violence, absolutely. But understanding that solidarity, just showing up together, was critical.
It was a strategic fight, too. Those citizenship schools she helped set up with Edgar Nixon. The sources call them acts of rebellion disguised as education.
I like that.
Yeah. They weren't just teaching reading and writing. They were teaching people how to navigate that intentionally confusing, unfair registration process, giving them the tools,
to challenge the system.
Exactly.
And those literacy tests, the examples in the sources are just mind-boggling.
Aren't they?
Asking things like, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Or demanding you recite the entire Constitution from memory.
It's clear what the goal was?
Yeah, the sources make it plain. It wasn't about knowledge. It was designed specifically to fail educated Black applicants while letting illiterate whites pass. Her groups were preparing people for a rigged game.
And think about her work with the youth councils. That was incredibly forward-thinking.
Teaching teenagers?
Yeah, the sources show she was teaching teens not just about rights and history, but about nonviolent resistance strategies, building that next generation.
Wow.
Many of those kids became the foot soldiers of the movement later on.
Yeah.
They directly credited her with their political awakening. She wasn't just fighting the current battle. She was building the future army, so to speak.
But doing this work, it came with constant threats, right?
Absolutely. The sources mention anonymous phone calls, cars following them home after meetings.
Cross burnings after registration drives.
Yeah, and she learned, the sources say, from her husband Raymond, how to handle that fear. Not ignore it, but channel it.
Use it.
Use it to sharpen focus, strengthen resolve.
There's that one story, that incident in 1944.
Right, escorting voters.
Yeah, and they get surrounded by a mob. And the sources highlight her composure, just standing her ground, calmly explaining their constitutional rights, in the face of potential violence.
Even back then, her quiet strength, that unshakable.
Okay, so let's shift into the early 1950s. By this point, the sources describe Montgomery as a place that had basically perfected the art of racial segregation.
Yeah, perfected. It wasn't just random incidents anymore. It was a meticulously designed, heavily enforced system.
It created these two totally separate worlds for the city's, 120,000 residents?
Right. Maintained by law, by custom, and always, always by the threat of violence. The sources show how every single public space, every interaction, was governed by this racial hierarchy.
And the buses, they come up again and again, the most visible symbol, the sources say, and the most humiliating.
And the numbers really tell a story. 75% of the riders were Black. That's 40,000 people every day.
Relying on them.
And enduring what the sources call that choreographed ritual of degradation. Daily.
That phrase, choreographed ritual, it really captures it.
It was built into the rules. The front 10 seats, always for whites, even if they were totally empty.
Even if the back was packed.
Exactly. And that middle section was completely arbitrary. Black passengers sitting there had to give up their seats and move back if even one white person needed a seat in that row. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about demonstrating power.
Enforcing inferiority moment by moment.
Precisely.
And the sources are really clear. It went way beyond the buses. It was this elaborate web, they call it.
Everywhere. Separate water fountains, restrooms, building entrances, libraries, often segregating. Black patrons couldn't even use the main library or were severely restricted.
Theaters, balcony seats only. Restaurants, hotels, even cemeteries were segregated. It was designed to hit you at every single turn.
And economic oppression was woven right through it. The sources show Black residents were largely stuck in the lowest-paying jobs: domestic work, manual labor, agriculture.
Limited options.
Very limited professional paths,
Yeah.
Often only serving the Black community within their own underfunded, segregated institutions, like the school where Rosa Parks' mother taught.
And even Rosa's job at Montgomery Fair, a skilled seamstress, but not allowed to be a sales clerk on the main floor. That itself shows the system.
Exactly. Housing segregation, too, creating these physical barriers. Overcrowded Black neighborhoods often had terrible infrastructure, unpaved roads, poor sewage.
While white areas looked completely different.
A constant visual reminder of the hierarchy.
You mentioned the buses being particularly cruel. Why them specifically?
Well, think about the daily intimacy and the sheer necessity. You had to use them to get to work, to school.
Right, no choice for many.
So it forced this daily encounter with the system's oppression. It created what the sources actually call systematic trauma.
Systematic trauma, wow. And the drivers themselves, they had a lot of power, didn't they?
Immense power. The sources note they often carried guns. They basically had police authority on their own bus.
So they could enforce these rules however they wanted?
And humiliate passengers with impunity. The sources give these shocking examples: drivers making Black riders pay at the front, then forcing them to get off and reboard through the back door.
And sometimes just driving off before they could get back on.
Yes. or deliberately stopping short in bad weather, making people walk through mud to get on or off. Little acts of cruelty, daily.
And this connects right back to Rosa Parks' own history. That incident in 1943.
With driver James F. Blake.
Yeah, the same driver from 1955, wasn't it?
The very same one. The sources say he physically threw her off the bus back in 43 for walking down the aisle instead of going around to the back door after paying.
And she avoided his bus route after that.
For 12 years, according to the sources.
Yep.
12 years she deliberately avoided that man's bus.
Shows you the impact. So the sources really emphasize the constant vigilance needed just to navigate this system.
Absolutely. Minor infractions, not stepping off the sidewalk fast enough for a white person, maybe making eye contact the wrong way, using a tone someone perceived as uppity.
Could trigger violence.
Could trigger serious consequences. It demanded constant self-policing just to stay safe.
But, and this is crucial, the sources also highlight the resilience within the Black community. It wasn't just passive suffering.
Not at all. They built these parallel institutions, places that fostered dignity and resistance. Churches were huge community hubs, safe spaces to organize.
Sanctuaries where Martin Luther King Jr. would eventually arrive.
Exactly. Schools, even though underfunded, taught Black history, heritage, survival skills. There had been earlier economic boycotts. Testing the waters.
And the Women's Political Council.
Right, led by Joanne Robinson. The sources show they had been actively planning for a bus boycott for years, just waiting, strategizing, looking for the right case, the right moment to launch it.
So by 1955, the picture the sources paint is this: a city with this incredibly rigid, total system of segregation.
Yeah.
But also one where resistance was organized, where the community had infrastructure, and where you could see cracks forming, like the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board decision knocking down school segregation, legally at least.
And right in the middle of this, you have Rosa Parks. She's 42. She has decades of this lived experience, decades of that quiet, dangerous activism.
Known for her character.
Known for her unshakable principle, as the sources say. A deeply trusted figure within a community that was, well, ready.
Yeah.
Ready to act.
Understanding the sheer depth, the breadth of that system, like these sources lay it out, it makes her act on December 1st. And the community's incredible year-long response, the boycott.
So much more profound. It wasn't just a sudden outburst. It was a deliberate confrontation.
Planned, in a way.
Planned by the community.
Yeah.
Maybe not that specific day by her, but the confrontation itself was coming. And it was launched by someone who'd been chipping away at that structure piece by piece for years within a community that had been laying the groundwork for that fight.
And that really is the core takeaway, isn't it? From this deep dive into these sources, that famous moment, it wasn't some isolated act out of the blue.
No. It was the culmination of a lifetime. A lifetime spent observing, resisting, organizing, all within this system designed specifically to strip away dignity and humanity.
We've looked at the wartime context, those painful ironies.
The dangerous, persistent work of voter registration, empowering young people, building trust, laying that critical groundwork.
And just the meticulous architecture of Montgomery's daily segregation, but also the quiet strength, the strategic planning happening inside the Black community.
Yeah. The woman on that bus, she'd spent decades building the skills, earning the reputation, developing the kind of moral authority you needed.
Not just for that one moment of refusal.
Exactly. But for the grueling year-long battle, the boycott, that came next.
It really leaves you with a thought, doesn't it, when you look at these sources?
Yeah.
These iconic historical moments we all remember, the ones that seem so sudden, so transformative.
They often aren't sudden at all underneath.
Right. They're so often built on this foundation of years, sometimes decades, of much less visible, often dangerous, relentless work by countless people.
So what does really understanding that tell you about how real, lasting change actually happens? How many other pivotal moments have these unseen histories just waiting to be uncovered?